Hi, this is Professor Kahan Lust with another lecture in History 1301, United States History to 1877. Today is Lecture 16, The Mexican War's Aftermath. As the war with Mexico dragged on, as house-to-house fighting continued, as door-to-door fighting continued, many Americans got kind of tired of what was going on. They were demanding that there be an actual end to this war at some point. And as an example of how Americans viewed this war and viewed what the war should be about, a Pennsylvania Democrat in the House of Representatives named David Wilmot put forth a provision in a military appropriations bill as a way of saying, if we're going to claim that this war is about our national honor, if it's about killing Americans on American soil, if it's not really about any of this other stuff, then we ought to put our money where our mouth is. So Wilmot attached this amendment, or the proviso, as it was called, to a military appropriations bill, a bill that would fund the war with Mexico. And what the proviso declared was that slavery would be illegal. Slavery would be forbidden in any territory that the United States would acquire from Mexico. There was an understanding that once this war is over, the U.S. will get a fairly big amount of territory. So if it's not about slavery, very simple. Let's say no slavery in that territory. Now, this bill passed the House of Representatives, and for what it's worth, it passed the House of Representatives fairly easily. But it failed in the United States Senate. And the reason it failed in the Senate was because there were equal numbers of free and slave states. So those slave states, as long as they kind of stuck together, they could kill any bill that was anti-slavery or was perceived to be anti-slavery. Now, the United States finally does, as we saw in the end of the last lecture, the United States finally does win this war. Polk winds up getting essentially what he wanted, which was the northern half of Mexico. He had switched gears and said he wanted all of Mexico, but his initial efforts were about gaining the northern part of Mexico. So he settled for that northern half in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States had increased not only its territory, but its population. But Ralph Waldo Emerson was pretty prophetic in terms of how he described the war with Mexico. The United States was never going to be the same after this war, and Emerson said, quote, "The United States may be able to conquer Mexico, but like arsenic, it will bring down the country." So he's very clear about this. Conquering Mexico was the first step, as he saw it, to a civil war, and of course, Emerson was right. Now, the first issue to test American resolve post-war with Mexico is going to be the issue of California's statehood. Now, many Americans previous to this war really didn't care about the political fight about expanding American territory because, remember, the political fight is about what role slavery plays in the expansion of the West. And many Americans simply assumed, dating back even to the Louisiana Purchase era, that the land that the United States would conquer or could conquer would, for the most part, be barren, it would be wilderness, it would be unfit for human habitation for a number of years. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who bought Louisiana, said that he believed it would be at least 100 years before Americans could actually settle in that region. So he didn't really see much of an issue over this sort of stuff, his interference in Missouri notwithstanding. Many people believed that the cry over the expansion of slavery was ridiculous because they associated slavery with things like cotton cultivation. And it was pretty obvious that in a lot of this land that gets conquered from Mexico, in a lot of the land that made up the Louisiana Purchase, it was pretty obvious you can't grow cotton there. So people thought this was a silly argument. California was going to be a place that is going to test the United States' resolve, and it's going to be a challenge to the United States. You can see just by looking at this map here that California is quite literally on the other side of the continent compared to what we think of when we think of the United States. This area in pink on the left-hand side is what made up the quote-unquote Mexican cession as it was called. So all of this land here is the land that the United States gets from Mexico. And right over here is what most people really associated with the United States. Now, in order to get to California, people didn't think there would be this rush to California, because if you wanted to go to California, there were really only two ways to get to California. A person could sail from the East Coast, and they'd sail down, they'd sail all the way around South America, make a left-hand turn and go up the coast of South America, all the way through the Pacific until they, boom, finally hit California. The other option would be to put out on the East Coast and sail down somewhere like to the Isthmus of Panama, or to some place like Nicaragua. And if a person went there, what they could do is they could get off of their ship. The shipping company would drag the ship across, and then they would bring it all the way up this way. By doing that, it would cut 3 to 4 months off the time of the trip. But a lot of people didn't like that particular version, because it was pretty ugly when it came right down to things like yellow fever and malaria. So all of that stuff that I just showed you notwithstanding, most people thought that the best way around was the way around South America, and a lot of people didn't really worry about it. They didn't think people would be flocking to California. But something's going to change California, and that something is going to be the gold rush. And this gold rush is going to create a mass of humanity rushing into California in a search for what they hoped would be easy gold. And what you're seeing here are gold miners who are engaged in that search for gold. What they're doing is they're panning for gold. And there are quite literally thousands of people who rush to California. And the reason for this rush, very simple, is in 1848, a New England corporation was building a sawmill. There was a company that went there with the express purpose of dealing with all of this massive amount of timber in Northern California. So they're going to cut it down and create this massive timber industry there in the Northwest. While they're building this sawmill, a worker for this company named James Marshall finds this enormous piece of gold on what became known as Sutter's Mill. When he claimed that he found this gold mine, he said he's found this massive mine, this massive deposit of gold. And he wasn't kidding about how big this gold mine was, how big the strike was, because it quite literally doubled the world's gold supply. Now, I want you to think about this as we move forward, because this is going to be one of the problems for California. When we talked about the Specie Act during President Jackson's administration, I talked about how Jackson had created a problem in the economy of deflation. He took money out of circulation, which increased the value of the currency, which meant consumer prices went down. Well, think about what doubling the supply of gold is going to do. Gold, hard currency, is literally the monetary supply. So if you double the gold supply, if you increase the gold supply, the result will be the decrease in the value of gold. And because the gold has less value, it will take more of it to purchase consumer goods. So consumer goods increase. That is inflation. And inflation is going to be a key part of why the problems in California become so bad. Within 1 year of California's settlement in 1848, over 100,000 people began moving into California. California became so inundated with people that the United States Army had to send soldiers in. They had not left very many people in California because they believed there would be no need for it. But all of a sudden, when you have these when you have tens of thousands of people showing up looking for gold, there is a distinct need for order. This became even worse when U.S. military personnel showed up, heard about the gold, and said, forget this, I'm deserting my post, and I am going to go search for gold. By 1853, more than 300,000 people had moved to California. I shouldn't say almost. It was overwhelmingly male. Of the first 100,000, to give you an idea, of the first 100,000 people who moved to California, only 700 of them were women. So this mass of humanity that's moving into California is going to make it an odd place. And while at first it's migration from within the United States across to California, the other option or the other issue that's going to happen here is that people are going to start coming from all over the world. People are going to be coming from Australia, from Chile, from China, as all of these countries are going to feel the pull of that gold rush. And some places like China are going to see a push effect where they've got natural disasters and political strife going on at home. So there's a pushing out factor, if you will. So there's this stampede of humanity to California. It's almost exclusively male, and it's going to ensure that California is going to be a very different place right from the get-go. One of the things that California is going to have to deal with is massive inflation. Now, part of it has to do with supply and demand. Part of it has to do with gold, but some of it has to do with price gouging as well. And I'm not going to test you on these numbers, but I want you to listen to them to understand how difficult life would be for somebody in California. For example, a loaf of bread cost about 4 cents per loaf in New York. In California, it costs 75 cents, and adjusted for inflation, we'd be talking about $19.04 in today's currency. Coffee was $5 a pound in California, which adjusted for inflation would be the equivalent of about $127. Apples cost $5 a piece. A pan, the basic piece of equipment that those gold miners used when they panned for gold, it kind of had this little sifting piece in it that would allow the dirt to fall through, and it would hold the gold in the net. That pan cost 20 cents initially, but soared to $15. So it went from an average, again, adjusted for inflation, from an average of about $5 to $380. Books cost about $30 a piece in California, or today, again, in today's equivalent, about $750. So there's a massive amount of inflation that's happening in California. And whenever there's this inflation, there's wherever it is and for whatever reason it is, there's always a search for scapegoats. There's always a question about who's causing this, who's to blame, and what do we do about this? And this made things in California incredibly troublesome. People had gone there seeking fortunes and realized they were not going to find that fortune. And this result of all of this was a very strong sense of xenophobia or fear of foreigners taking hold in California. For example, places like Sonoma, California believed that the big reason that city was going in the wrong direction was the emigration of Mexicans and Chileans into Sonoma. So the city fathers, their solution to this was burn Sonoma to the ground and start over again. So there's a very strong issue of inflation, and there's a very strong sense of xenophobia in California. But California is not going to be the only place that sees this. There is a ton of this same fear and this same sense of scapegoating that's going on in California in the rest of the United States. It was absolutely a national problem. So to get to the Civil War, to understand how we get to a Civil War, we also have to understand part of the immigrant debate at the time. And here, a political party called the Know Nothing Party is crucial to our understanding. For most of American history, from our political history, politics have been hereditary, meaning that men tended to vote as their fathers did. And then later, when women are brought into the voting process, children tend to vote as their parents do. Even when it's a question of children saying, I hate what my parents stand for, I dislike that, so I'm going to always vote in the opposite direction that I think my parents would, that's obviously still a hereditary connection to people's voting. Now, that means that a lot of times when we see this stuff happening in this country, we may see some slight ideological changes, but more often than not, we see a fair amount of continuity. But sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes issues occur, sometimes circumstances occur that cause the political situation to just explode. And when that happens, that's when we see the big shifts in the political discussions. And this happens with the know nothings. The know nothings are important for two basic reasons. One thing, they're incredibly anti-Catholic and incredibly anti-immigrant. So they fit within the framework of this time period. But the reason they're important is that first, they wind up destroying the Whig Party. They consciously attack the Whig Party, and the Whig Party doesn't have an answer for what they are doing. The Whig Party has no solution to the problems and the issues being raised by the Know Nothings. So the Whig Party just crumbles. The other reason they're important is that they're going to sort of fatally divide the Democratic Party. And what I mean by that is the Democratic Party is going to continue to exist, but they're not going to be a force in political politics again until the 1870s. There's a strong sentiment that the Democratic Party was wildly out of touch in the United States. And it really isn't a matter of today where people attack the Democratic Party about liberalism. Here, it's about their answers to slavery, the various sectional crises we've talked about, their answer to what to do about the expansion of slavery. Democrats seem to be out of touch because they're split into these different factions within the party. Now, this is something that's important to see because we see it happen on a number of occasions, at least 5 times in our political history. We've seen this where the political circumstances occur. Okay, people think of themselves as tolerant, as, quote, non-ideological. You hear a lot of people talk about they don't vote based on party, they vote on who they think is the best candidate, who has the best ideas, and all of that stuff. We tend to talk about ourselves as Americans as, quote, compromising people. And for a lot of our political history, this is partially and largely true, but only because throughout much of our history, political parties have existed as the machinery by which politicians win elections. They don't exist to delineate divisive issues. In fact, they work opposite of that. More often than not, when the party system is working, quote unquote, they work to compromise on these truly divisive issues so that they don't get to the forefront of Americans' minds. But what happens when they can't compromise on them? That's when these issues become explosive. To give you an idea, to give you an example of this sort of stuff, in 2001, a massive corporation right out of Houston here, Enron Corporation, fell. They wound up becoming they became exposed as being involved in essentially this massive corporate shell game that hid all sorts of losses, committed fraud in the process of doing this. When all was said and done, when the dollars are counted about how much got lost in the U.S. economy, about 1/3 of the pension funds in the United States had disappeared, and economic loss totaled approximately $1 trillion. Now, that's in 2001 and 2002 that those dollar figures are being accounted for. So it's much bigger if we accounted for inflation today. But there wasn't a political revolution in 2001. There was no political shift in this particular era because both the Democrats and the Republicans recognized that this is a divisive and destructive issue for each of them. So they compromised the circumstances away. They dealt with they created a bipartisan way of handling the problems, and the problem essentially just kind of disappeared and faded from the conscience of most Americans. It's only when the system is weak, it's only when the political parties are incapable of this type of compromise, when they can't find any common ground and say this is destructive to both of us, that's when the explosive issues come to the forefront. And that's what we see in the 1840s and the 1850s. As long as this party system is strong, slavery is not going to come to the top of the debate. But if the system weakens, then slavery is just going to bubble over. Now, the know-nothings are critical to all of this. The know-nothings were, again, typical of this era. Hatred of Catholicism had some very deep roots in the United States. I talked about that when we talked about the Irish immigration in the 1840s, so there's no need to go through that again, except to say that there was a large anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment to that anti-immigration sentiment of the 1840s. Now, they came in large numbers, remember? They came as workers who, according to native-born Americans, were taking jobs away from them and worshipped in a very strange way. So a lot of those native-born Americans did not like these Irish Catholic immigrants. What emerges to deal with this problem is a new group that organized itself as, quote, the Supreme Order of the Star Spangled Banner. Now, that Supreme Order of the Star Spangled Banner, in its early days, in its earliest incarnations, was kind of a social group that, there's only one way to describe this. They basically went around, looked for immigrants, and then beat the crap out of them whenever they found them. Now, they had an official name, the Supreme Order of the Star Spangled Banner, and they morphed into a political party with a very distinct political agenda. And the official name of that political party was the American Party. But more popularly, the American Party was known as the, quote, Know Nothing Party. And the reason for that is back in the days when they used to kind of be this vigilante anti-immigrant group, beat up people, when the law enforcement would show up and say, we want to know what's going on here, and they'd start questioning people, these people would say, I know nothing. I don't know anything about this. And they got derisively nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. But the Know Nothing Party wound up, or the Know Nothings as part of this. And then when they took the political route, they kind of stuck that Know Nothing issue, stuck with them. Now, they came up with a very specific plan. A lot of times when these third parties show up and they bubble to the forefront and then they crash and burn, people can look at it in hindsight and say, well, it's obvious why they crashed and burned. They didn't have an agenda. Well, the Know Nothings, or the American Party, whichever term you want to use, they definitely had a specific agenda. What they wanted was they wanted a 21-year residency requirement for voting implemented. So they weren't talking about banning immigrants. They weren't even talking about banning immigrants from voting, but they were going to make it a very long time before an immigrant could vote. So an immigrant comes to the United States, they've got a 21-year residency requirement before they can become a citizen and actually vote. They wanted office holding limited to native-born Americans. Now, many of you have read the Constitution of the United States. It was actually assigned to you in Module 2. And you'll notice that in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, there's no requirement that a person be a native-born American. The only office that has that sort of limit, that has that requirement for it, is the presidency. The presidency required that a person be a native-born American citizen or an American citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Here, what they would be asking for, very clearly, this limiting office holding to native-born Americans, it would require a constitutional amendment. But make no mistake about it, they believed that the idea of having immigrants come to the United States and then ultimately become, office holders, be it at the local level, at the state level, or the national level, this was a bad, bad, bad idea. And because these people associated alcohol consumption with immigrants, for all of the reasons we talked about when I talked about the reform era in this country, the Know Nothings also wanted a ban on alcohol. Now, It's a very clear plan. Okay, it's an obvious plan. There's no question that these are the platforms. And when they say this is the platform, if a person ran for office as a quote know nothing, these were the principles they were expected to conform their candidacy to. But it should also be obvious to you that the big problem in the United States was that inflationary economy. And all three of these, while they are specific items on an agenda, they had absolutely nothing to do with the economic problems in the United States. So they've got a clear agenda, but they're not addressing the fundamental problem. Now, nonetheless, they are still very successful in the United States. Within 2 years of their founding, by 1850, the Know Nothing Party dominates politics in New York, in Pennsylvania, where they have a large number of immigrants coming in. They are dominant in California, and they are dominant in the so-called border states. Now, what border states in this context means is the states that border the area between slavery and freedom. So states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Delaware, Maryland, they were border states during this era. Sometimes historians throw Missouri in there, but that's another story for another day. So they dominate in these border states. By 1854, they had completely destroyed the Whig Party to the point that the Whig Party ceased to exist. Many Whigs, the conservative Whigs, wound up going with the Know Nothings. Some who were a little bit more, we'll just call them open to things like immigration and the like, they wound up going with the Democratic Party. But there were a lot of Whigs who just were kind of out there, kind of operating as political independents. By 1856, however, the Know Nothings themselves were actually gone. So they have this very quick rise to the top and then an equally quick fall off. By 1856, they have gone away, ceasing to exist, because it turned out they were completely ineffective. And it's not a surprise why they were ineffective. When people start electing congressmen who are know nothings, when they start electing governors who are know nothings, they get all of the things that they want at various state and local levels. They get people who support these residency requirements. They get people who ban alcohol. They get people who will pass local initiatives that say only native-born Americans can hold office. But the longer they're actually in office, the more Americans realize their solutions are not fixing the problems. We've banned alcohol, but the economy still stinks. So maybe it's not immigrants. Maybe it's not alcohol consumption. Maybe it's not having too many immigrants as office holders or anything like that. On top of that, Americans also became convinced, especially anti-slavery people, became convinced that there's another conspiracy at play in the United States. And that's something that we'll talk more about in the next lecture. But that idea, that other conspiracy, was known popularly as the slave power conspiracy. They said it's not Irish Catholics who we think might be taking orders from the Pope. It's slaveholders in the South who are engaged in a conspiracy that has destroyed our country and is thus, quote, the enemy we need to deal with. Now, we're going to move on. We're going to get back. We're going to take it right back to California again. There's an old joke about the Houston Chronicle that whenever they cover an event, there's a Texas angle to it. If, for example, Tokyo were destroyed by an earthquake and Godzilla happened to come out of the ocean and start stomping all over Tokyo, and Godzilla stepped on a Texan and crushed him, the headline in the Houston Chronicle would not be giant dinosaur terrorizes Tokyo. It would be Texan dies in Tokyo. This suggests an exaggerated sense of the importance of Texas, but it's not a sort of myth about the exaggerated importance of Texas. Texas is critically important to all of the things that I've been talking about. That's why I talk about the Texas Revolution in U.S. history classes, and I'd be talking about the Texas Revolution even if we were talking in a class in New Hampshire, because Texas is critical to all of the things that we've been talking about here, and it's going to set another crisis in motion. All of that gold that was available in California, lots of people wanted access to it, and Texans were no different. Texans wanted access, so they're going to go to California. They want gold, and they're going to mine for it, but they're going to take their slave labor with them. They want their slaves to be the ones who are mining for that gold. And California miners were already angry. They were already facing competition as they saw it. They're facing competition from France. They were facing competition from Asian immigrants. They were facing competition from Chilean immigrants, from, quote, Mexican immigrants, even though those were people who, by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, were actually American citizens. These miners in California were convinced we got too much foreign labor coming in, and it's driving labor power down. Labor value is going down, which means people who are working do not make as much money. So when Texans show up with their slaves and plan to mine for gold, California miners say enough is enough. We're not going to let these people bring these workers in here that don't have to be paid and have them destroy the system of free labor. Now remember, free labor means that the worker is free, hence the term free labor. They're free to take their labor to the highest bidder. That means they want wages to be as high as possible. And anything like a glut of immigrants coming in, or even slave labor coming in and undercutting them, means wages go down. They don't want that. So, in addition to passing a number of laws aimed at getting rid of immigrants in California, local groups of vigilantes make it clear to Texans you have 24 hours to leave or else. And the or else could range from being dragged behind a horse to being tarred and feathered to actually being lynched. The term lynch and lynching gained prominence in California during this time and wound up being applied to later. But these were some of the solutions Californians planned to use against Texans. Now, as soon as all of this stuff is over, as soon as this crisis, if you will, has passed, California convenes a constitutional convention, which is the first step in statehood. And at that constitutional convention, a delegate who happened to be a miner proposed banning slavery from California and banning all free blacks. So California would be an all-white state. There would be no slaves, no free blacks, no nothing. Now, obviously, banning free blacks means that these people are not banning slavery because they've got a moral problem with slavery. They're banning slavery because it challenges the notions of free labor. They want any restriction or challenge to free labor gone in California. And this constitutional convention in California, they pass all of these measures. Now, they are ready for admission to the United States as a state. However, the southern states block California's admission. And the reason they block it is very simple. At the moment, before California would come in, there were 15 free states and 15 slave states. If California comes in, it will be 16 free states and 15 slave states. Now, Southerners know what that means. They don't care one bit why Californians are anti-slavery. In fact, a Southerner might sit down with a Californian and find out that, hey, we're equally racist as each other. But those Californians will never, ever, ever vote pro-slavery or for any pro-slavery agenda items because it challenges free labor. So Southerners couldn't care less why they're anti-slavery. They just know that they are anti-slavery, and that cannot be. Slave states are going to be, if this works out, slave states are going to be in the minority, and Southerners look at this and go, well, where are we going to pull more slave states from? We can't pull them from anywhere. Now, the first thought here is, as this is all going on, is, well, maybe we can compromise about this, because after all, every single time an issue like this has come up, Congress has always come up with a compromise. But Congress is not going to be able to compromise. Congress is becoming more and more factionalized. The term that we use today is, we call it tribalism. But here it's becoming more and more factionalized. It took Congress 63 ballots to name the Speaker of the House. Now, the Speaker of the House is a critical role in Congress. It's very important. The Speaker of the House determines the legislative agenda, makes the committee assignments, calls the House to order, all of these sorts of things. And it took them 63 ballots to name a Speaker of the House. Now, why I say that and why I went into detail about this is there's no question one of these two jobs is more important. The Speaker of the House versus the doorkeeper. The doorkeeper is the person who in Congress opens up the door, literally opens up the door to Congress, and says to an entering congressman, "Good morning, Your Honor." That's the doorkeeper. It took them 103 ballots to name a doorkeeper. So there's no way they're going to compromise about California. It just doesn't look like it's there. And to throw another fly into this already ridiculous ointment, Southerners met in Nashville, Tennessee, at something called the Nashville Convention. And they got together, talked about all this stuff, and said, if California is brought in as a free state, that's it. We're out of here. We are seceding from the Union. So in 1850, we're talking about secession again. Now, again, just like I talked about at the opening of this stuff, who cares about California? Why would Southerners care? Why would Southerners look at California and make an issue over slavery? It's obvious. You cannot go into California and grow cotton. You can't grow tobacco. You can't grow sugar. You can't grow rice. You can't grow indigo. All of these things, all of these products that are associated with slavery cannot be done in California. So why do Southerners care? Even if we look at Nevada, at Arizona, at New Mexico, at West Texas, if we look at parts north of that, like Montana and Nebraska and North Dakota and South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, all of these places, you're not going to grow any of that stuff there. So why are Southerners making an issue of this? Well, very simply, the, quote, peculiar institution, as they were already calling it, is becoming more and more peculiar. What the South is doing, their lifestyle, their legacy, all of that stuff is becoming more and more exceptional. And when I say exceptional, I mean it's not the norm. For example, as all of this debate is raging on, France and Denmark had both abolished slavery in 1848. They had joined the British Empire, which had done so a decade before. Large parts of the world were ending slavery, not ending the slave trade, mind you, but ending slavery. To give you an idea of how isolated the United States is becoming, slavery by 1850, when California is talking about statehood, slavery is legal in 5 places only in the world. It's legal in Brazil, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in a place called Dutch Suriname, and in the United States. But here's what makes it even more isolating on some level. In Brazil, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and in Dutch Suriname, the enslaved population is declining. They don't have the ability in all of those places to have a naturally reproducing slave population. They were dependent on their numbers. They were dependent on the slave trade. And once the slave trade goes away, those numbers decline and decline and decline and decline and decline. Only in the United States is the enslaved population increasing. Now, some of you may have been taught at one point in your life or another by somebody who was from the South, and they told you that, well, slavery was on its way out. Slavery was on the decline in the United States. And that is nonsense. It's utter nonsense. Slavery was declining in some parts of the world. It was even, as we're going to see, declining in some parts of the South. But the reason it was declining in parts of the South was because people in those states were selling their enslaved people to people in other states in the U.S. And in those areas, those numbers were added to the original numbers in those states, and those enslaved peoples continued to have children for another decade, to the point that by 1860, there are 4.5 million slaves in the United States. Now, by comparison, in 1830, there were about 2 million enslaved people in the United States. So just looking at the numbers, the slave population in this country doubled. So the United States is becoming increasingly isolated. But there's something else that I just hinted at. There's something else. Slavery is becoming geographically concentrated in the United States. Those people who always talk about, well, slavery was on the decline, they look at places like Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, and Delaware, and they point out the population was declining in all of those places. And the reason is because industrial pursuits were increasing. People were arguing about taxation of the enslaved and coming to the conclusion that slavery does not benefit them in those states. So they, undoubtedly, slavery is declining in those states. But rather than freeing their enslaved, people in Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, and Delaware were selling their slaves to people like Texans, Mississippians, Alabamans, and Georgians. So in those states, we see the numbers increasing. So there's no net loss, okay? But this has a bigger consequence. Remember, you've got 15 free and 15 slave states, okay? 15 free, 15 slave. If Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, and Delaware become, quote, free states, ultimately, again, just like California, it's not going to matter why they're free states. They're going to be free states, and it will move into the other column. And it will be, instead of 15 to 15, Southerners' worst nightmares is that it's going to be 19 to 11. 19 free states and 11 slave, because 4 of them will have moved over to the free column. They don't want that. That terrifies them. So, what do? They've got to do something to protect slavery, because it's becoming increasingly the exception. They've got to, as they see it, they've got to demonstrate that slavery is capable of transitioning into the modern world. It can be utilized for things other than cotton, tobacco, sugar, rice, indigo. It can be used in industrial pursuits, that we can, quote, make steel and use slaves to make steel. We can build railroads and we can use slave labor to build the railroads. We can use slave labor to grow corn in the Midwest. That's what Southerners are arguing. It has to be a, quote, progressive and progressing institution in order to be saved. So they've got to do this. This is the Southerners' position. Now, Henry Clay believes, he's still around, but he's kind of coming to the end of his life. He believes he's got a solution to all of this. He can cobble together one more compromise bill and get everybody to sign on to it, and everybody will be happy. What Clay proposed was something that he's going to call the omnibus bill, multi-layered. Okay, he's going to propose this one big multi-level bill that will settle all of the questions all at once. Now, the first problem to deal with is to deal with Texas. Texas still did not have a reasonable border. So what Clay wanted to do, since Texas was claiming that New Mexico belonged to Texas, Clay wanted to pay off Texas. Just appropriate money at the congressional level and pay them off to give up New Mexico. So that's one thing he wants. Clay also proposes that we eliminate the slave trade, not eliminate slavery, but eliminate the slave trade in Washington, D.C. His sensibility on this is that it doesn't look good for us when we have foreign dignitaries coming in and we tout things like the Washington Monument, we tout the White House, we tout the Congressional Building, and say these are all symbols of American freedom and liberty. And then while we're explaining that, we've got slave auctions going on the other side. Clay said there's no way to square that. So let's eliminate the slave trade, the business of trading slaves in Washington, D.C. He said California should be admitted as a free state. He says that's basically what they want anyway. So rather than doing something that forces them into something they don't want, let's bring California in as a free state. We'll bring California in as a free state. Now he says any other territory going forward that becomes a state will be admitted, with regard to slavery, will be admitted on the basis of popular sovereignty, which sounds reasonable. The people who settle an area will decide for themselves about popular sovereignty. Now, sounds like a great idea, but this has a huge flaw in it. This program or this plan of his has a huge flaw. One big flaw is that nobody's really sure if the compromise actually means everywhere, as Clay says, or if it means all of this stuff over here. When some people hear, going forward, all other states will be popular sovereignty, they start thinking, well, maybe we can start questioning the Missouri Compromise line. That's not the case. Clay made it very clear that it'll be this, quote, Utah territory, the New Mexico territory, and these areas that were claimed by Texas. Those would be the areas decided by popular sovereignty. Now, many Southerners thought that's silly. What we ought to do is we ought to just take that 3630 line and just go across. But many other Southerners prevailed and said, look, this is better for us. This is better if we leave it all open to the whims of the population. So, potential problems right off the bat for this issue of popular sovereignty. Now, that's one issue. Now, what winds up happening when it goes before Congress to be settled, virtually nobody supports this plan. People are arguing about it. People are saying, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. We can't possibly allow for more slave states to come in, while others are saying we can't possibly allow for more free states. So very few people actually supported this bill. Now, one senator is watching this. Stephen Douglas is watching this. Stephen Douglas is from Illinois. And he notes that some support one proposition but oppose all the other propositions in the omnibus bill. He notes that this particular point is supported by all of these people over here. This point is supported by people over here. And he starts taking note of this. He notes nobody's in favor of all of it, but different groups of people support different points of this omnibus bill. Now, Zachary Taylor, who's the president of the United States, he's the hero, one of those heroes, quote unquote, from the war with Mexico. By now, he's the president of the United States, and he weighs in. He's not in favor of this compromise, of this omnibus bill, in any way, shape, or form. And he says this is silly. He says if you look at California, New Mexico, all of these areas, no reason slavery will ever be used in any of these places. So Taylor says what should happen is, instead of this whole big omnibus bill and popular sovereignty, blah, 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 he says California ought to be brought in as a free state right now. I'm going to keep giving you a little tail of the tape here. That, if Taylor has his way, is going to be 16-15. He then looks at the Pacific Northwest and says the Pacific Northwest will never be slave territory. You can't use it to grow sugar, cotton, tobacco, whatever. So the Pacific Northwest ought to also immediately be carved up into 6 more states and brought in as free states immediately. That would make it 22-15. So 12 more senators, 14 if you count California, many more representatives from free states. That's a huge majority against slavery. But then remember, those slaveholders, their worst nightmare is what happens if those 4 border states cease to be slave states and become free states. Well, if that happens, if that nightmare scenario happens, it would be 26 free states to 11 slave states. So Southerners are looking at this and going, oh my God, if this happens, they've got the necessary 2/3 majority to pass a constitutional amendment and kill slavery. We cannot let this happen, they say. So they are mobilizing in Congress. They're mobilizing to stop both of these things, to stop Clay's omnibus bill, but to stop Zachary Taylor's proposition too. That cannot be allowed to happen, they say. And then 3 things intervene to stop all of this stuff. Taylor drops dead. Now, the conspiracy theory is that it resembled arsenic poisoning. So a lot of people started talking about, well, Taylor was bumped off as a way to threaten people into not voting for what he wanted. Now, it turns out Taylor's body wound up being exhumed in the 1990s. Turns out he died of cholera. But in the moment, people have heard this conspiracy theory and they are terrified. Taylor's replacement, his vice president, a guy named Millard Fillmore, favored Henry Clay's compromise, that big omnibus bill. Now, that's convenient for Southerners. It's not ideal, because in an ideal world, Fillmore would say, no, 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 no free states anywhere. But this is better than what Taylor's offering. Secondly, Texas bondholders, people who own IOUs, start hearing about this proposal to pay them off, to relinquish Texas claims. So they start going, if that happens, our bonds will be paid off at our full value. So yeah, we want that. So they start bribing congressmen in order to support relinquishing Texas's claims. And Congress ultimately does vote to do that, to pay off those Texas bonds in order to relinquish their claims to New Mexico. And then third, Stephen Douglas, who I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, senator from Illinois, he takes Clay's massive omnibus bill. And remember what I told you he noticed about these different groups of people. He takes that big omnibus bill and says it will never, ever pass this way. So he breaks it up into separate component bills, and it kind of gets named after the fact as the Compromise of 1850. But if you know what the omnibus bill is, you know what the Compromise of 1850, because it's simply a matter of, the only difference is the omnibus bill is all of those propositions in one bill, while the compromise is all of those propositions in separate individual bills. So the Compromise of 1850, Texas relinquishes their claims to New Mexico for $15 million. California is going to be admitted as a free state. All of the other territories will be admitted under the idea of popular sovereignty. I don't have it on the board here or on this screen here, but it does ultimately end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And then it also throws in something called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, Douglas was right on the money on this stuff about the issue of these different coalitions. Over the course of the voting, there will be only 2 senators who vote for every part of the omnibus bill. Every other part took different coalitions to get the laws, these individual laws, passed. So it was right. He was right. It would never have passed if submitted whole. But it's got this last part. Everything Clay wanted, except for this one last part, that Fugitive Slave Act. The United States had given Congress the authority to pass laws that facilitated the return of runaway slaves to their original owners. But while they had passed a fugitive slave law in 1792, it really didn't have much teeth to it. It was very difficult to enforce, and it was completely inadequate, leading to thousands of slaves running away every single year. And as these debates raged on in Congress over the omnibus bill, over the, quote, compromise, whatever, Southerners said, fine, you want us to vote for various proposals here? Give us a strong, enforceable Fugitive Slave Act, and we will consider it. We will do it. I shouldn't even say they'll consider it. They say we'll do it. And the law that gets passed is this Fugitive Slave Act. And make no mistake about it, when it is passed, Stephen Douglas thinks we've settled everything. Just like Clay wanted, we've passed this series of laws that have settled everything. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, though, it's a weird law. Any person of African descent could be accused of being a runaway slave simply on the basis of an affidavit. All it took was a sworn statement by some individual saying, that person, I know that person, they are a slave. And that's enough to bring that accused person up for charges as being a runaway. So that's one problem. A second problem with this new law is that the person who was accused of being a runaway was basically barred from, first, testifying in their own behalf, on their own behalf, and they were also barred from generally assisting in their own defense. They were basically told, you will sit down, you will be kept quiet, and you will say nothing in this court. In terms of the court that actually ruled on this, the truth of the affidavit would be ruled on by a commissioner, and these local judges would be paid $5 if they ruled against the affidavit, meaning if they said, I've looked at the evidence and this person is clearly not a slave, they are clearly a free person, they are free to go. If they ruled in that way, that judge got $5. But if they ruled in favor of the affidavit, saying this person is clearly who the affidavit says they were, they are clearly a runaway slave, they are hereby ordered back to slavery, that commissioner got paid $10. So you can figure out that a lot of these commissioners actually voted in favor or ruled in favor of what was best for them from an economic standpoint. This new law also required all citizens to assist in the return of fugitive slaves on punishment of fines or imprisonment themselves. So law enforcement could come along and just deputize anybody and say, you are now deputies and you are charged with helping me find this person who's an accused runaway slave. Now, as this happens, Southerners are very happy about this because they've got, finally, a very strong Fugitive Slave Act, one that is enforceable, one that will theoretically bring a lot of slaves, quote, back. But Northerners are horribly offended by this. The Fugitive Slave Law, or the Fugitive Slave Act, in their opinion, required them to be complicit in the institution of slavery, and they fought it. They fought it bitterly. In the case of an accused runaway named Anthony Burns, caught in Massachusetts, a mob surrounded Burns and dared authorities to try to attempt to return him to slavery. Massachusetts' governor wound up calling out 20 regiments of the state militia to enforce this law. Now, many free blacks in this country believed that there was no hope of resisting slavery courtesy of the Fugitive Slave Act. Approximately 15,000 of them fled to Canada. One very high-profile African American named Frederick Douglass, who I've talked about in class, he wound up going on an extended speaking tour of Europe. It was not a coincidence that he did this after this law was passed, because Douglass was an admitted fugitive slave. I think I mentioned word for word his quote that he said, I am a thief. I stole this body from slavery. So it's no coincidence that he goes on this extended tour of Europe on a speaking engagement. So this compromise, the Compromise of 1850, was supposed to settle the slavery issue once and for all. It's all clean. We're all good. But in fact, it does not. It does the exact opposite. The inclusion of the Fugitive Slave Act was fatal to the compromise, because instead of putting the questions about slavery at rest, it reignited the fight over slavery. So this idea that the questions or the fight is over, it's a very short time before it just all explodes again. All right, join me next time in Lecture 17, where we start talking about the irreconcilable conflict that is facing the United States. We'll see you next time.